So Jed's a high school junior. He's recently started bodybuilding, and his buddies are taking him to the gym, and he's working out, and he's getting strong, and they want to figure out what his maximum bench press is, what's his maximum amount of weight he can move, and how can he exert the maximum force. So there's 4 things that contribute to maximum force. Whenever your muscles are contracting, there's 4 things that contribute to maximum force. So let's take a look at some of those 4 things. But first, before we do anything, we have to consider how this actin-myosin is arranged. We call that their length-tension relationship. Because if there's a good overlap between the actin and myofilaments, then there's going to be good, strong muscle contraction. If there's not good overlap, or not ideal overlap, maybe too much or too little, then the strength of the contraction goes way down. Let's take a look at how that works. And this explains why a proper warm-up is always important, because that's going to establish good length-tension relationships. So right now we have a muscle that's in a pretty good spot. So notice what happens if we have a muscle that's unstretched. Notice that there's too much overlap and the muscle can't exert a whole lot of strength. If it's moderately stretched, then we have ideal overlap and we get lots of strength in that contraction. If it's overstretched, there's not enough overlap and we only get a small contraction. So ideal overlap will equal a strong contraction. So a good warm-up is going to establish this correct length-tension relationship. An unstretched muscle, too much overlap, is cramped up, let's say, or just too tight, you're not going to get a strong contraction. A muscle that is overstretched or torn, pulled, you're not going to get a strong contraction. But a good overlap leads to a good, strong contraction. So a proper warm-up helps establish that correct length-tension relationship, which leads to good performance. Recruitment just refers to the number of motor units involved. So it's a nerve that's connected to some bundles of muscles. Some of those bundles of muscles are really big. There's lots of muscles in there, lots of muscle fibers in there, muscle cells. Some are a little bit smaller. But recruitment just refers to this, how many motor units are needed to lift at a certain amount of weight. So every time your muscle contracts, the whole muscle contracts. All right, so understand that. Every time your muscle contracts, the whole thing contracts. So whenever your bicep contracts, the whole bicep contracts. But why is it that sometimes I contract it with 5 pounds, but other times I might contract it with something much lighter? What's the difference? It's the number of motor units that are involved. In other words, like how many muscle cells are called to action. All right, so that's what a motor unit is. It's a set of muscle cells called to action. Kind of think of it like the military. Sometimes the military has a small job to do. So they're just like, all right, we're just going to send those 10 soldiers, that little group, and we're going to send them with their commanding officer out to do that little job. But sometimes a bigger job is needed. So they have a whole bunch of these little groups of maybe 10 all in one big group. They might call that a company or a platoon or some larger group. And then they might have a whole division, and then they might have the whole army. So there's like divisions within the army, the structure in the army where you have small groups of men, larger groups of men, huge groups of men, and each of those have a little different number of individuals involved to do whatever the job is. The bigger the job, the more people that might be required to do it. Just like your muscle cells. Small jobs just require a small amount of muscle cells to contract your muscle. Large jobs might require lots of motor units to work on. So let's take a look at kind of how that looks. Here's our muscle cell. Here's our bundles of muscles. Notice I have several different motor units that are involved in that whole muscle. So this one motor unit happens to control 3 of those bundles, But there's other motor units that might be larger or smaller that also control some bundles of muscles. So you might ask, how do motor units then influence the strength of muscle contraction? So one of the ways is the number of motor units. More motor units means more muscle cells are involved, bigger contraction. Sometimes it's just the cells in each unit. So let's say you might have 4 motor units that equal 1,000 muscle cells. Over here you might have 1 motor unit that equals 1,000 muscle cells. So rather than using like a smaller unit, it might just be using one large unit. And then sometimes it's just muscles are precise and they're small. Sometimes for precise movements, it's just small motor units. Sometimes it's gross movement, a whole bunch of muscles are involved to move your body in some large, dramatic kind of way. You need a large muscle even to do that. So Jed starts with bench pressing 135, that's his body weight. And in this case, that might be a significant amount of weight for him. So that's going to require a lot of motor units and a lot of cells in each unit. Look at it kind of like this. Here's an individual, they're trying to score the ding and get the prize. So first they just contract a few motor units and they're not able to hit it very far. Next they contract a larger motor unit and they're able to hit it quite a bit farther. Now they're going to try to contract more motor units. So not just the small one, not just the medium one, but lots of motor units get involved to be able to hit it all the way up and ding the bell. All right, so all the motor units get involved, lots of strength can be exerted. So Jed easily completes his set of 135. His friends are surprised. So they add 20 pounds. Now in this case, he's going to either have to recruit a larger motor unit or more motor units, all right, to deal with that increased weight. So here are some movements from your body that are precise. Little tiny muscles are used to move the eye. So that's just a precise movement. The eye just moves slightly, but it's small muscles that are involved. Those are considered precise movements with small motor units. Gross movements are like moving your quadriceps, extending your leg. All 4 of those muscles are involved. Big muscles. Lots of motor units are involved just to move your leg. So here you are lifting weights, here's Jed lifting weights, and he starts with a light amount of weight, 80 pounds, and he's only using a few motor units to lift that 80 pounds, and he can do it successfully. Increase the weight, though, he's going to have to increase the number of motor units in order to be able to lift it. Now, we might ask this question as we keep increasing the weight and keep increasing the number of motor units recruited. Can we lift an infinite amount of weight? What's going to hold us back? Well, eventually we're going to get to a place where we're using all of the motor units that we have, but the weight's too much. So even though all of our motor units are recruited, they're all in the job, trying to get the job done, they can't perform it. It's too hard. The work's too hard for even all of our motor units. Just remember again that the whole muscle contracts, and no matter how many motor units are involved, the whole muscle contracts. The second thing then that's going to influence muscle contraction is something called summation. That's a strange phenomenon. Whenever we have a muscle that contracts, the muscle cell will contract all the way or not at all. So muscles contract all the way or not at all. So when you think like, why is it that I can bend my hand up and touch my ear? Sometimes I can do that really lightly. Other times I can do it with a lot of force. Why is it that I just don't do it with a lot of force all the time? If muscle cells contract all or none, why is it I can just a little bit or a lot? Well, that has to do with how many motor units are recruited. So if only a few motor units are recruited, I can move my arm with very lightly. If I have a lot of motor units recruited, I can move my arm with a lot of strength or force. But every time those muscle cells contract, that's called a muscle twitch, and they contract all or none. So here's one muscle cell contracts completely and then relaxes completely. But there's a strange phenomenon called summation. What that means is if I can trigger my muscle cell to contract a second time before it has a chance to relax all the way, I get to add the strength of those two contractions together. So here's my muscle cell, it's contracted. Now it's starting to relax, but I contract it again. And it starts to relax, I contract it again. And it starts to relax, I contract it again. And each time I contract it again, I'm adding the strength of those contractions together. I'm summing the strength of those contractions together until my muscle is completely contracted. So here, I'm very rapidly sending nerve impulses to that muscle, causing it to contract rapidly, until it gets to a point where it's completely contracted. We call that tetanus. So here's a case of sustaining a muscle contraction. All right, so we might grab something, we let it go. We grab something, we let it go. We grab something, we hang on to it. Now I'm sending nerve impulses faster than the muscle has a chance to relax. And because of that, my muscle can become completely contracted. We call that tetanus. Can it stay completely contracted forever? The answer is no. At some point, I'm going to run out of energy, fatigue will set in, and my muscle will not be able to contract even though I'm sending nerve impulses. So think about it like you're carrying your groceries into your house. You put all your grocery bags into your arm, you're running down the sidewalk, you're trying to keep your muscles contracted. You're sending impulses to contract them before they have a chance to relax. So you're summing the strength of those contractions. But you get to the door's locked, and you're trying to hold on because you don't want to drop the eggs. And it's hard to hold on, What are you doing? That's summation. You're adding those together. Once you run out of energy, that's fatigue. And even though your brain is saying, hold on, keep that muscle contracted, if you don't have enough energy, it won't matter. So how does summation influence the strength of a muscle contraction? How does it impact it? Well, one thing it does is it increases the strength of each motor unit because you're summing those together. You're adding the strength of that contraction together. Another is that it allows sustained contractions. It allows your muscles to stay contracted for longer periods of time. In just an instant. It allows them to stay contracted for a while. And if they stay contracted or if they're always slightly contracted, we call that muscle tone. In other words, whenever you touch your muscles, they're nice and firm because they're slightly contracted. Flaccid just refers to no tone at all, completely limp. So here's Jed, and Jed's working out, and he's trying to keep the bar from falling on his chest and crushing him. What's the role of summation in this controlled descent? Well, here it is. It's going to allow his muscles to sustain a contraction, to keep pushing even though that bar is coming down. It keeps it from coming down quickly. He can hold it back and sustain that contraction, hopefully for a long period of time. Let's take a look at muscle tone compared to being flaccid. So as long as it's getting impulses, it stays slightly contracted, and that's what we call muscle tone. So we keep sending the impulses, the twitches keep happening, faster and faster. We sum the twitches up until it's here. We call that tetanus, completely contracted. And now it's starting to run out of energy, so even though it's still getting the nerve impulses, it's running out of energy, and we call that fatigue. All right, so that's muscle fatigue. So here we are, one twitch, contracted, relaxes. If we can contract it before it has a chance to relax, we can sum the strength of those contractions. We can continue to add those contractions together until we reach tetanus. That is a sustained contraction. Once we run out of energy, however, we call that fatigue. We're unable. The muscle is completely unable to contract. So here's muscle tone again. Notice I've got this stimulus that's keeping my muscles slightly contracted. If I were to stop the stimulus, the muscle's no longer contracted at all. That's called flaccid. So Jed's like, feel my pythons, feel my pythons. And what makes it feel firm? So anytime your muscles feel firm or tight, that's muscle tone. It's just they're slightly contracted because they're always getting these nerve impulses. If we were to somehow knock you out so that nerve impulse stops or cut that nerve, sever that nerve, the muscle will become flaccid, unable to contract, just elongated and weak. The third thing that influences muscle contraction is ready energy. Like, what kind of ready energy do you have for that contraction to happen? And there's some sources of ready energy. Your body stores ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell, in the muscle cells, allowing them to contract right away. Once those muscles contract right away and you burn through that stored ATP, we can recycle it with this thing called creatine phosphate. So that's a chemical that can recharge our batteries and recycle. Glycogen then is a complex carbohydrate that gets broken down to glucose. We get some ATP from that too. And we can break down that glucose as long as we have lots of oxygen present in the mitochondria and get a whole bunch of ATP from it. But usually when you're weightlifting, you're only going to use the stored ATP you have and maybe some creatine, but you're barely going to get the chance to break down a whole lot of glucose to make ATP, which is what causes you to tire out pretty quickly.
How does energy supply influence the strength of muscle contractions? 3 ways. The first way is this. Energy powers the motor units. So as that motor unit contracts, it has to have energy in order for those cross bridges to form, that power stroke, the detachment. The energy has to be there in order for that muscle to contract. But energy is also required to sustain contractions. So you're holding on, your muscles are summing their strength until they're completely contracted, but then it starts to drop off because of the lack of energy. So energy is necessary to sustain contractions. The more energy you have, the longer you can sustain the tetanus. As soon as the energy runs out, you start to experience fatigue until your energy is gone. There's 2 major ways that you can get energy. One way is aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen. You can get lots of energy that way for long periods of time. Anaerobic respiration, however, is what your body uses to get energy for the muscle cells to contract when they're only contracting for a short amount of time. So let's kind of see how that works. Here you are running, let's say. In the first 6 seconds of that exercise, you've burned through all the ATP that your muscles have stored. You can recycle it, recharge it with the creatine phosphate, and here you are at 10 seconds, and you've used up most of the ATP now that's been recharged. Here, at 30 to 40 seconds, you're breaking down sugar to now get energy to those muscles. So if your race only lasts 10 seconds, you never get to this. If your race lasts longer, now you need the oxygen for aerobic respiration to produce lots and lots and lots of ATP. However, if the oxygen is limited and you start converting to lactic acid fermentation, you get a lot less ATP. So 32 to 34 ATP if you have oxygen, only 2 ATP if you don't. So the energy drop off is huge, and the fatigue starts to mount with the buildup of lactic acid and soreness. After your exercise, or if you have a downturn in your exercise, you have a chance to get some oxygen back to those muscle cells, try to use the aerobic respiration and get that amount of ATP up so that you can continue to exercise. The fourth and final impact or thing that influences the strength of a muscle contraction is the type of muscle cell. Some muscle cells we consider slow twitch fibers, others we consider fast twitch fibers. Let's take a look at some of the differences. A fast twitch fiber is what we use for power, so rapid movements, sprinting, lifting really quickly. Those fast twitches, the hand is faster than the eye, those kind of things are all our fast twitch fibers. We use those for power and speed. Our slow twitch fibers, though, we use for endurance. They have a hard time tiring out. So when we're running a marathon, when we're hanging on for a long period of time, it's our slow twitch fibers that we use for endurance. We can build up the type of fibers that we have by either doing resistance or aerobic exercises. Resistance exercises tend to increase our fast twitch fibers, the number of those fibers, and the strength of those fibers. Whereas aerobic exercises like running or biking for long periods of time can increase the number of our slow twitch fibers as well as their ability to endure. these long amounts of exercise. Let's take a look at some of the differences here. Fast twitch fibers are rapid, powerful. They contract rapidly. They are white in color typically. They're going to depend a lot on aerobic respiration. The slow twitch fibers are typically the darker red ones, lots of mitochondria in there because the mitochondria are used for the aerobic respiration. There's a lot of capillaries that are going to be built to those muscles to supply them with blood because they need lots of oxygen. Here's another example, a sprinter, lots of white fast twitch fibers for power. A long distance runner, a marathon runner, lots of the slow twitch, more higher mitochondria, darker red in color, muscle cells. So if you have lots of white muscle fibers, like a bodybuilder, you could lift heavy weights. So like Jed, if he develops more of these white muscle fibers, he gets a little bulky, larger cross-section area to his muscles, he'll be able to lift more, be stronger like a bodybuilder. If, on the other hand, he's running cross-country or some long distances, he'll develop more red muscle fibers, muscle cells, and he'll be able to endure longer lengths of activity. So if Jed decided to run cross-country instead of weightlifting, he would do more long-distance exercises like running or biking, and his muscles would change in a few ways. More mitochondria buildup, the development of more of these slow twitch fibers here. What happens is you have some intermediate fibers, and depending on the exercise you do, they either convert to the slow or they convert to the fast twitch. So it's not like that you're getting more muscle cells, it's just that they're converting to one or the other. So for a while in your life, your muscles are plastic, like they're able to go one direction more or the other direction more. But after you get a little bit older, most of the intermediate fibers have decided one way or the other. So if he were to emphasize this, a lot more blood vessels going to those muscles to supply them with oxygen, more capillary development, darker muscle cells. If he decides to go with this larger cross-sectional area, the muscles get bigger inside, more white, fast twitch fibers. So let's take a look at just sorting some of these. Fast twitch fibers are going to be for rapid movements, whereas slow twitch will be for more slow movements. The slow twitch are going to have more mitochondria. The fast twitch will have less endurance. The fast twitch will tend to rely on fermentation for their energy, whereas the slow twitch will rely more on aerobic respiration. Fast twitch is for powerful, rapid movement, whereas slow twitch are for more prolonged endurance kind of activities. So here's Matt. Matt wants to lift 300 pounds. What's going to happen within his muscles to perform that feat of strength? So he's going to recruit as many motor units as he possibly can. Hopefully he's warmed up a little bit to get good cross bridging. He's going to recruit as much as he can. He's going to try to stimulate the contraction before it has a chance to relax so he can sum the strength of those contractions. He's going to hopefully have enough available energy to be able to do that feat of strength, and hopefully he's going to have lots of white muscle fibers to be able to do that. Some athletes take creatine as a dietary supplement. How could this possibly help? Creatine is one of the few supplements that you can take that actually have some proven benefits, although there are still some questions about its effectiveness, as well as some warnings about its potential hazards. But basically what creatine is trying to do is allow your ATP to recharge quickly so that you can have a little bit more time to do that hard exercise. So for example, if you were sprinting normally for 10 seconds, a little bit of creatine might help you be able to recharge the ATP after 10 seconds and sprint for another 5. So that helps just recharge the batteries of your muscles. Sarah wants to run cross country. She's going to try to do aerobic exercise. That will help her improve. And how will her cells change as a result? More mitochondria, more capillaries to those cells, more relying on oxygen and aerobic respiration.